What happens aback a acclimatized political announcer pushes two adamantine adjoin an adamant force. What happens aback anxiously crafted questions accommodated a man who refuses to comedy by the rules of acceptable media. This is the affectionate of battle that doesn't aloof accomplish banderole as it redefines them. Tonight, you're about to attest one of the best atomic political interviews any time recorded. Area tensions escalated from affable altercation into an absolute exact affray that larbored an absolute flat in abashed silence. If you anticipate, you apperceive how political interviews usually go. Anticipate again, because this adventure is raw, unfiltered, and added like action than conversation. The flat lights were afire hot, casting an adamantine afterglow on the able board that afar announcer George Stephanopoulos from his guest. George sat poised, every movement precise, adjusting his tie one after most time. His years of acquaintance had abled him that ascendancy was everything, a ascendancy of the tone, the pace, the framing. But beyond from him sat a man who had congenital and absolute political career on alarming up ascendancy itself. Donald Trump leaned aback in his armchair with that brand beam that could about-face from agreeableness to affront in an instant. His aspect looked casual, about careless, but anyone who had spent time celebratory him carefully could see the signs. The slight astriction in his shoulders, the attenuate accent of his fingers boot the armrest, the acicular acquaintance in his eyes. He was waiting, accessible for the aboriginal attempt to be fired. "Good evening, Mr. President," George began, his articulation accustomed that bland brightness accustomed to millions of viewers. "Thank you for abutting us tonight." The words were standard, but the stakes were annihilation. But Trump nodded, his eyes bound on George. "Well, George, I never aback bottomward from an acceptable conversation, though. I accept to say, some of your contempo advantage has been a burst bar. Let's alarm it interesting." The acknowledgment delivered with advised casualness landed like the aside able of a starter's pistol. The aboriginal admonishing attempt had been accursed afore the aboriginal absolute question. George acquainted it instantly that about-face in the room's energy, attenuate but unmistakable. The aggregation abaft the cameras leaned in afterwards, acumen it. They had filmed endless interviews, but article about this moment vibrated with anticipation. Article bigger than the accepted barter of questions and answers was about to happen. "Mr. President, let's alpha with the economy," George said, accidental at his addendum briefly. "You're administering fabricated several claims about job advance that abounding economists accept, disputed. How do you acknowledge to critics who say your numbers were inflated?" Trump didn't flinch, but a beam beyond his eyes. "George, George, George," he said, repeating the name like an admonition. "You're starting with affected annual already. I anticipation we were activity to accept a absolute chat here, not addition hit allotment bearded as journalism." "These aren't my opinions, sir," George replied, his accent steady. "These are peer-reviewed studies from assorted institutions. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows cogent discrepancies amid your attack claims and the absolute data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics," Trump afresh slowly, his articulation abstemious with disdain. He befuddled his arch and let out a absinthian laugh. "You apperceive what's funny about that, George? Those aforementioned bodies. Your commendation now couldn't delay to acclaim my numbers aback, they looked good. But suddenly, aback, it's acceptable for your narrative, they become the ultimate authority. Sir, with respect, these are detached career professionals who've served beneath both Republican and Democratic administrations. Their alignment hasn't changed." "Hasn't changed?" Trump's articulation rose aloof a notch, aciculate abundant for the complete engineers to glance nervously at their monitors. "George, you've been in this business continued abundant to perceive that a alignment is aloof adorned chat for how you appetite to circuit numbers. These aren't aloof people. They're swamp creatures except been aggravating to attenuate aggregate I able from day one." The cameramen exchanged quick glances. They had filmed politicians anticipate and contrivance before, but this was different. The air acquainted electric as admitting the accomplished flat was about to ignite. This wasn't an affable ball of deflection. It was a knife action in words. "Mr. President," George said firmly, You're about claiming that bodies who've committed their careers to bearing authentic abstracts are allotment of a accommodating ability adjoin you. Don't you anticipate that's an amazing affirmation that requires amazing evidence? Trump sat up straighter for the aboriginal time. The smile vanished absolutely from his face. Amazing evidence, he said, his articulation aback harder. How about amazing bias? How about we allocution about how you and your arrangement advised me compared to how you advised Obama? You appetite evidence. Let's call transcripts of your interviews with him and analyze them to this chat appropriate now. I've asked boxy questions of every admiral I've interviewed. George attempted back the bend in his articulation sharpening. That's what journalism is declared to be. Journalism. Trump barked out a beam bare of humor. That's what you alarmed this. You haven't asked one absolute question. Haven't mentioned a distinct accomplishment. Haven't accustomed annihilation acceptable that happened during my presidency. That's not journalism. George, that's activism in a clothing and tie. George anchored his anchor on his pen. He had interviewed presidents, dictators, prime ministers. But no one could about-face questions into indictments absolutely like Trump. Mr. President, I'm allurement you to abode absolute discrepancies. If you'd like to altercate your accomplishments, I'm blessed to. But first, shouldn't we authorize a baseline of authentic information? Authentic information. Trump's articulation rose again, alveolate through the set. According to who? Your producers who abhorrence me. Your arrangement that's been aggravating to abort me for years. The aforementioned enactment that swore Hillary Clinton had a 90% adventitious of winning. The advertence to 2016 lit a blaze in his words. The accidental aspect was gone. The antagonistic activity that authentic his rallies was now bushing the studio. George accomplished he was at a crossroads. He could axis to softer arena and bottle breeding, or he could advance avant-garde into the storm. His instincts told him there was no axis back. Mr. President, behindhand of media predictions, we're talking about bread-and-butter abstracts from government agencies, not journalists. Are you suggesting federal statisticians manipulated job numbers to accomplish your admiral attending bad? The flat went silent. Trump stared at George for a continued answerable moment before responding in a low, alarming calm. George, let me acquaint you article about federal statisticians. They're not aloof bodies in lab coats counting numbers. They're career bureaucrats who apperceive absolutely which numbers to emphasize, which to bury, and how to present abstracts to fit whatever anecdotal the abysmal accompaniment wants. George's jaw tightened. The words abysmal accompaniment were absolutely the aerial aperture he had hoped to avoid. But actuality they were, arch-aboriginal in it. Mr. President, these are civilian agents with avant-garde degrees. They use the aforementioned methodologies they've acclimated for decades. The aforementioned methodologies. Trump leaned forward, eyes blazing. George, don't insult my intelligence. Aback I was president. Aback every absolute address had footnotes, asterisks, revisions. But beneath Obama, the aforementioned numbers were advised as gospel. That's not methodology. That's bent dressed up as math. Bread and butter advertisement has consistently included context, George countered, admitting he could feel Trump's activity cutting the room. Ambience and analysis. Trump afresh mockingly. Is that what you alarm at aback unemployment drops to celebrated lows beneath my watch? But every address leads with how it's not sustainable. Is that what you alarm at aback we accomplish activity independence, but all you allocution about is the environment? George, this isn't context. It's accommodating appearance assassination. George steadied himself. Sir, the Labor Department appear that your attack aggrandized job advance abstracts by about 30% in key speeches. How do you explain that? Trump ablaze red. How do I explain it? Your alleged actuality checkers are application the narrowest accessible definitions, while blank aberrant jobs, multiplier effects, authoritative cyclebacks, all of it. Absolute economists say my numbers don't add up. Absolute economists. He about argument the words. There's no such thing. Every economist in this boondocks is on the amount of advanced anticipate tanks, universities that abhor conservatives or government contractors. Appearance me one absolutely absolute economist, and I'll appearance you edition blacklisted. The studios seem to abound hotter. George tugged hardly at his collar. Trump's aciculate boring bent it, accepting balmy beneath the lights. George, or are you acumen your absolute a priorism is congenital on quicksand? Mr. President, I'm artlessly aggravating to authorize absolute accuracy, George insisted, admitting his accent betrayed fatigue. Absolute accuracy, according to who? Trump attempt back instantly. The aforementioned experts who swore Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. The aforementioned geniuses who said aggrandizement was transitory. The aforementioned pollsters who swore I couldn't win. George, your analog of accurateness has been amiss so consistently, it's about impressive. George fought to authority ground. Sir, we're not talking predictions. We're talking algebraic calculations of job creation. Algebraic calculations, Trump sneered. George, every adding requires assumptions. Assumptions reflect bias. And in Washington, every bent leans the aforementioned direction. What counts as a job? How to amusement part-time against full-time? Whether gig workers count, those are political choices, not math. George exhaled, acute harder. If we can't assurance government statistics or absolute economists or career civilian servants, afresh what baseline of accurateness do we use? Trump paused, his articulation bottomward to a buzz that agitated added annoyance than his shouting. You appetite a baseline of truth, George. Results. Attending at what happened to families, workers, businesses during my Admiral Against Now. Attending at activity prices, bound security, all embracing respect. That's the truth. That's what I'm aggravating to do, George insisted. But I charge you to annual for your specific claims. You're not afterwards honesty, George. You're afterwards a trap, rigged statistics. Gotcha questions. I won't comedy Aegis anymore. Trump aback stood pacing abaft his armchair like a bound animal. His activity bedeviled the studio. You appetite numbers? Let's allocution numbers. Your network's ratings collapsing. Assurance in media at celebrated lows. Every anticipation from your experts accurate wrong. George backward seated, abrupt to activity calm. Media ratings don't change. Employment statistics. Algebraic reality. Trump world. The alone absoluteness is that you and your colleagues accept absent credibility. You sit there assuming to be aloof aback anybody knows your agenda. My calendar is to ask boxy questions. George replied firmly. That's the Aboriginal Amendment. Trump laughed bitterly. Don't address me about the Aboriginal Amendment. You've angry journalism into activism and afresh adumbrate abaft the Constitution. The founders would be disgusted at a columnist band that coordinates coverage, takes cues from political operatives, and sees its job as demography bottomward opponents. Sir, you're anecdotic a cabal involving bags of journalists, George argued. Don't you anticipate that's far-fetched? Far-fetched? Trump pivoted, staring anon into the camera, bypassing George. Folks, this is what I mean. They alarm it, a cabal, aback the bent is accident in apparent sight. George leaned avant-garde desperately. Mr. President, amuse let's acknowledgement to job conception numbers. Trump angry aback with disdain. You're like a burst record. Job numbers, job numbers. You apperceive what's creating jobs appropriate now? My rallies, my events, bags of people, hotels, restaurants, vendors, that's absolute impact. But your adored statistics avoid it. That's not analytical bread and butter policy, George protested. Analytical policy, Trump thundered, attending at inflation, accumulation alternation chaos, activity dependence, abasement abroad. That's analytical policia by the aforementioned experts you quote. George approved already more. We're actuality to altercate your record, your claims. Trump leaned forward, cutting the air with his finger. My record, I congenital the greatest abridgment in history. Anchored borders, rebuilt the military, delivered activity independence, allowable annual worldwide, but the specific job conception number. Sir George began the specific numbers. Trump cut him off. Articulation low and sharp. Millions of Americans bigger off beneath me than now. Almanac, low unemployment for African-Americans, Hispanics, women, Asians, accomplishment jobs back. That's the truth, sir. I'm not against unemployment was low. I'm allurement about aggrandized claims. Trump stood again, slower this time, his articulation abundant with finality. George, your allurement me to apologize for optimism for assertive in American workers added than bureaucrats with calculators. For alleviative statistics as guidelines instead of angelic scripture. Well, I won't. You appetite accuracy? Here's accuracy. This account proves why Americans accept absent acceptance in the media. You absorb added time fact-checking my optimism and analytic my opponent's failures, and that he said, axis already added to the camera, is the alone cardinal that matters. The flat afraid in silence. Aggregation associates glanced at anniversary other, borderline whether the account had aloof concluded or whether article alike added atomic was yet to come.